Sadie Combs stood on the porch of the Holbrook farmhouse, with everything she owned wrapped in a flour sack, and watched Mrs. Holbrook close the door without saying goodbye. The morning was October cold, frost still white on the grass, and Sadie's breath hung in the air like the ghost of all the words she wasn't allowed to say. She had been with the Holbrooks since she was 12 years old. 6 years of waking before dawn to start the fire. 6 years of cooking, cleaning, mending, feeding chickens, hauling water, scrubbing floors. 6 years of sleeping in a room barely larger than a closet, eating whatever was left after the family had finished, wearing clothes that had been worn out by 3 generations of Holbrook women before reaching her. She had been told it was charity. She had been told she was lucky. She had been told that orphan girls didn't get to complain about the hands that fed them, even if those hands hit her when dinner was late or the eggs weren't gathered fast enough. Now she was 18, and the Holbrooks' real daughter was 16, and the room Sadie had slept in for 6 years was needed for someone who mattered. "There's work in town," Mrs. Holbrook had said that morning, handing her the flour sack and the 50 cents like a transaction being completed. "Boarding house might take you on. You're not pretty, but you work hard enough." Sadie had wanted to say something. She had wanted to ask about the 6 years of labor she had provided, the wages she had never received, the childhood she had spent being someone else's servant. But she knew better than to speak. She had learned that lesson early, with bruises that took weeks to fade. She took the 50 cents and the flour sack and walked down the dirt road toward town. But she didn't go to town. She didn't know why exactly. Maybe it was the thought of spending the rest of her life scrubbing someone else's floors. Maybe it was the cold and empty feeling in her chest that told her she would rather die in the woods than beg for another family's charity. She turned off the road after a mile and started walking uphill, into the forest that covered the ridges above the valley. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have supplies. She had 50 cents, a flour sack of worn-out clothes, and a body that knew how to work but not how to survive. She walked until dark, then walked some more because stopping meant thinking. She slept that first night, curled under a rock overhang, shivering so hard her teeth ached. She woke to a world covered in frost and the certain knowledge that she would not survive another night like that. The second day, she found a creek and drank until her stomach cramped. She found a bush with late berries and ate until her hands were stained purple. She kept walking uphill because uphill felt like a way, and a way was the only direction she wanted to go. Ezra Whitmore found her on the 3rd day. She didn't see him approach. One moment she was sitting on a fallen log, too tired and cold to move anymore. And the next moment there was an old man standing in front of her, thin as a rail and dressed in clothes that looked like they had been patched 100 times. His beard was white and wild, and his eyes had the particular brightness of someone who had spent too many years alone. "You're dying," he said. It wasn't a question. Sadie looked up at him. She didn't have the energy to be afraid. "Probably. How long since you ate?" 2 days. There were berries." Ezra made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a cough. "Berries won't keep you through a Kentucky winter. You got people?" "No." "You got a place to go?" "No." He studied her for a long moment, his bright eyes taking in her thin dress, her bare feet, the shawl that was more holes than fabric. Then he nodded, as if confirming something he had already decided. "Come on then, I'll show you something." Stay with me, because what he showed her is the reason she was still breathing when spring came and the people who had thrown her away were burying their dead. The tree stood in a hollow about 2 miles from where Ezra had found her, in a part of the forest that felt older than the rest. It was a white oak, and it was enormous, the trunk so wide that 3 men holding hands couldn't have circled it. The bark was gray and deeply furrowed, and the branches spread out overhead like the rafters of a cathedral. But the remarkable thing wasn't the size. The remarkable thing was the hole. The trunk was hollow. Some ancient injury, a lightning strike or a disease that had healed over, had eaten out the heartwood and left a cavity large enough to stand in. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for Sadie's shoulders, but inside, the space expanded into a chamber roughly 6 feet across and 8 feet tall. Ezra stood at the entrance and watched Sadie examine the interior. The walls were smooth, the wood darkened by age but solid. The floor was covered with a thick layer of old leaves and debris. The air inside was still and cool, but not cold. Even now, in late October, the temperature inside the tree was noticeably warmer than the air outside. "Oak holds heat," Ezra said. "The walls are 2 feet thick in places. Wind can't touch you in there. Rain can't reach you. Snow piles up outside, but inside stays dry." Sadie ran her hand along the interior wall. It was warm to the touch, holding the day's sun even as the evening turned cold. "You lived here?" 40 years ago, when I first came to these hills. Spent 2 winters in that tree before I built my cabin. Would have spent more if the tree had been closer to water." He pointed downhill. "Creek's a 1/4 mile that way. Spring never freezes, even in the worst cold." "Why are you showing me this?" Ezra was quiet for a moment, his bright eyes distant. "Because I recognize the look you're wearing. I wore it myself once, a long time ago. Because nobody else is going to help you, and I'm too old to watch another person die when I know where they could live." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small hunting knife, the blade worn thin from years of sharpening. "This is all I can give you. The rest you'll have to figure out yourself." Sadie took the knife. It felt heavier than it looked, heavy with the weight of what it meant. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You've got maybe 3 weeks before the real cold comes. That tree will keep you alive, but only if you make it ready." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. The Holbrook's farm is in the valley below. If you can see their chimney smoke, they can see yours if you're careless. Build your fires small and burn them hot. Wet wood makes smoke. Dry wood makes heat. Don't forget the difference." He walked away into the forest, and Sadie never saw him again. She heard later that he had died that winter, found frozen in his cabin in January. But by then, she had learned everything he had taught her, and she had survived because of it. The preparation took every hour of the 3 weeks Ezra had promised her. Sadie worked from dawn until dark, and then she worked by moonlight because she knew she was racing against something that wouldn't wait. The first task was bedding. The leaf litter on the floor of the tree was old and damp, compressed into a mat that would hold moisture and steal heat. She raked it all out and replaced it with fresh fallen leaves, gathered by the armful from the forest floor. She piled them 2 feet deep, then covered them with pine boughs she cut from the evergreens on the ridge above. The pine needles were waxy and water-resistant, and they smelled like something clean and alive. The second task was sealing the gaps. The entrance to the tree was narrow, but not tight, and there were smaller cracks where the bark had split over the years. Cold air would find every opening. Sadie gathered clay from the creek bank and mixed it with dried grass, creating a crude mortar that she packed into every crack she could find. The entrance she covered with a flap of bark she had pried from a dead tree, hung on a hinge of twisted vine so she could pull it closed behind her. The third task was fire. Ezra had warned her about smoke, but she needed heat, and heat meant flame. She experimented until she found a solution. She dug a small pit just outside the entrance of the tree, lined it with stones from the creek, and built her fires there. The smoke rose straight up, dispersed by the branches overhead, invisible against the gray sky. The heat radiated inward through the narrow opening, warming the cavity without filling it with fumes. She learned to bank the coals at night, burying them in ash so they would stay hot until morning. She learned which wood burned cleanest and which made the dangerous smoke that could be seen for miles. She learned to cook her meals quickly and eat them inside the tree, where the warmth of the food became the warmth of her body. The food itself was the hardest problem. Sadie had no gun, no traps, no fishing line. What she had was the knife Ezra had given her and the desperation to use it. She dug for roots along the creek bank. She collected the last of the autumn nuts, cracking them open with stones and eating the bitter meat inside. She found a patch of wild onions and harvested every bulb, burying half of them in the floor of the tree to keep them from freezing. By the time the first snow fell in mid-November, she had a small store of food, a warm and weatherproof shelter, and the beginning of something she hadn't felt in 6 years, control over her own survival. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was hard. The old-timers in the valley said it was the worst in 20 years, though old-timers always said that. The snow piled up 3 feet deep in the hollows, and the temperature dropped to 20 below on the coldest nights. The creeks froze over except where the springs kept them open. The deer vanished into the deepest thickets, and even the squirrels seemed to disappear. Sadie lost 15 pounds she couldn't afford to lose. There were days when all she had to eat was a handful of nuts and a scrap of dried root. There were nights when she lay in her nest of leaves and pine boughs, shivering despite the warmth of the tree, wondering if she would wake up in the morning. But she always woke up. The tree held its heat through the longest nights, the thick oak walls absorbing the warmth of her small fire and releasing it slowly through the dark hours. The bark flap kept the wind out. The leaves kept the cold ground from stealing her body heat. She was hungry and thin and tired, but she was alive. In January, a snowstorm buried the valley for 3 days straight. Sadie watched from the ridge above as the Holbrook farm disappeared under a white blanket. She could see the chimney working overtime, a constant plume of smoke that spoke of a woodpile being depleted faster than anyone had planned. She later learned what happened down there. The Holbrooks had been burning through their winter stores at an alarming rate, the drafty farmhouse demanding more and more fuel as the cold deepened. By the end of January, they were burning fence posts. By February, they were burning furniture. Mrs. Holbrook's husband, a man named Virgil, who had barely spoken to Sadie in 6 years, went out in the February thaw to find more wood and didn't come back. They found him 2 days later, frozen in a drift a quarter-mile from the house. He had gotten turned around in the white and walked in circles until his body gave out. Sadie heard about the death from a trapper she encountered in early March, when the worst of the winter had finally broken. The trapper looked at her with something like wonder, this thin girl living in a tree on the ridge, surviving alone when grown men were dying in the valley below. "The Holbrook widow is looking for help," the trapper said. Farms falling apart without her husband. She's asking around town if anyone knows where to find strong backs willing to work. Sadie thought about Mrs. Holbrook standing on the porch, handing her 50 cents and telling her she wasn't pretty, but she worked hard enough. She thought about 6 years of labor and no wages. She thought about the bruises that had taken weeks to fade. "I don't think I can help her," Sadie said. The trapper shrugged. "Probably for the best. Heard she was looking for someone who'd work for room and board. No wages, just charity." The spring came slowly, as springs do in the Kentucky hills. The snow melted in patches, then sheets, then floods that turned every creek into a torrent. The trees began to bud, first the maples with their red flowers, then the oaks with their cautious green. The world woke up, and Sadie woke up with it. She had survived 5 months in a hollow tree, with no supplies and no help, and no reason except spite and stubbornness. She had eaten things she couldn't name, and slept through nights so cold that morning seemed like a miracle. She had lost weight and gained calluses, and discovered that she was harder to kill than anyone had ever given her credit for. When she walked down into the valley in late March, she wasn't the same girl who had walked up it in October. The thin dress had been replaced by a coat she had sewn from squirrel pelts, ugly but warm. Her feet were wrapped in bark and hide. Her hair was tangled and wild, and her face had the lean sharpness of someone who had learned what mattered and what didn't. She walked past the Holbrook farm without stopping. She could see the gaps in the fence where the rails had been burned, the sagging barn roof that no one had repaired, the general air of collapse that comes when a family loses its center. Mrs. Holbrook was standing in the yard, struggling with a bucket that was too heavy for her, and for a moment their eyes met. Mrs. Holbrook froze. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. She had expected Sadie to die on the ridge. She had probably hoped for it, if she had thought about it at all. And now here was the orphan girl walking past in a coat made of squirrel skins, alive when Virgil was dead, surviving when the farm was failing. Sadie didn't speak. She didn't need to. She just walked past, heading toward town, leaving Mrs. Holbrook standing in the yard with her heavy bucket and her empty house, and the growing understanding that the girl she had thrown away was worth more than she had ever known. The town was called Elkhorn, a small collection of buildings at a crossroads in the valley. Sadie went to the general store first, where she traded her remaining 50 cents for a sack of cornmeal and a length of fishing line. The storekeeper looked at her squirrel skin coat and didn't ask questions. Plenty of hill people came down looking stranger than she did. She found work within a week, not at a boarding house, but at a sawmill on the edge of town. The owner, a man named Crawford, needed someone to cook for his workers, and he didn't care what she looked like as long as the food was hot and ready on time. He paid her in cash, $1 a week plus room and board, and he never once told her she was lucky. Sadie worked at the sawmill for 3 years. She saved her money, coin by coin, until she had enough to buy a small piece of land on the ridge above the valley. Not the hollow where the oak tree stood, but close enough that she could walk there when she needed to remember what she had survived. She built a cabin on that land, a proper cabin with 4 walls and a roof and a chimney that drew clean. She built it with her own hands, using skills she had taught herself during those months in the tree. It wasn't large, but it was hers, and no one could ever throw her out of it. The great oak tree stood for another 40 years, until a lightning strike in 1926 finally brought it down. By then, Sadie was in her 60s, a respected woman in the community who had raised 3 children and buried one husband and never forgotten where she came from. When she heard the tree had fallen, she walked up to the hollow and stood beside the massive trunk, laying on its side now, the cavity exposed to the sky for the first time in centuries. She didn't cry. She wasn't the crying type. But she stayed there for a long time, remembering the nights she had spent inside those walls, the fire she had built, the hunger she had endured. She remembered being 18 and alone and certain she would die. And she remembered waking up every morning to discover that she hadn't. The local paper ran a small article about the tree when it fell, mentioning that it was believed to be over 300 years old. The article didn't mention that a girl had once lived inside it, surviving a winter that had killed grown men. It didn't mention the squirrel skin coat or the bark flap door or the pine boughs on the floor. Those details weren't the kind of thing that made it into newspapers. But Sadie knew, and her children knew because she told them, and their children knew, because some stories are too important to let die. Mrs. Holbrook lived until 1899, growing steadily poorer as the farm declined around her. She never remarried, never recovered from Virgil's death, never managed to find the kind of help that Sadie had once provided for free. In the end, she sold the farm for less than it was worth and moved to town, where she lived in a boarding house until her death. Sadie paid for the funeral, not because she had forgiven Mrs. Holbrook, but because she wanted everyone in town to know that the orphan girl who had been thrown out with 50 cents was now the one writing checks. It was petty, perhaps, but survival teaches you that sometimes petty is the best kind of victory. The hollow oak is gone now, rotted back into the hillside where it grew for 3 centuries. But the ridge where it stood is still called Combs Ridge, named for the woman who lived there first in a tree, and then in a cabin, and then in the memory of everyone who heard her story. Some stories end with the protagonist building an empire or changing the world. This one ends with something smaller, but no less important. A woman who refused to die when dying would have been easier, who turned a hole in a tree into a home, who walked past the people who had thrown her away and kept walking until she reached somewhere better. If this story of hollow survival resonated with you, consider subscribing for more narratives of forgotten endurance. What is the tree in your life that could shelter you if you stopped seeing it as empty and started seeing it as enough?